Hey everybody, it's Alexandra with Optimum Joy, and I have Viktor Terpay here. He has been a therapist at Optimum Joy for some time now. And Viktor, you're talking about, well, I'll let you introduce the topic and why it's important to you because you're going to be better at introducing it than I am. So what are we even talking about today, and why is it important to you specifically?
Yeah, so today I'd like to just talk a little bit about vulnerability. And I think vulnerability is important to me because of my personal experiences. Um, One of the things that I just reflecting on my experiences is life, like modeling my experiences after um, people that were brave or courageous, or trying
Right.
to model myself after like looking at my heroes, my dad, and looking at superheroes, just remembering all these moments of courage and strength and want to be like that. And the challenge with that was that I never got to really experience or see
Right.
emotions,
Mm,
emotions of either sadness or vulnerable, or how to navigate through that. So for me, growing up, I've always wanted to be strong and wanted to be
yeah.
courageous, but never really knew how to express what was going on. And
Yeah.
especially going through really challenging experiences and really difficult moments in my life, I didn't know how to express or ask for help or reach out. So that kind of led to this building up this wall, this boundary, shutting down
Hmm.
and only
Yeah.
expressing emotions of anger or
Yeah.
frustration, or just straight up withdrawing. And
Yeah.
so vulnerability, when talking about vulnerability, I think a lot of times in my context, it was weakness. It's associated with weakness, and you don't really want to be perceived as weak. So never really had that opportunity until later in my life, where I started to do my own work and experience and understand myself, try to understand what was going on with me. Um, and and I think that's why vulnerability is so important to me, is
Yeah.
just understanding the power of it, understanding how transformative it is, and how much strength and courage it takes to show up and be ourselves in spaces.
Yeah. Well, I'm hearing you kind of say very clearly that your definition of courageous has changed, whereas courageous used to be strong, fearless, this almost like superhuman, superhero type of persona. That now it's like, oh gosh, to actually like connect with people and to be vulnerable, that's like a true courageous thing. And I really resonate a lot with that, Victor, because whether it's being a man or the culture you grew up in or all kinds of things that we could look into that. I think I personally, just in identifying as like an Enneagram 8, which is all about kind of harm reduction, like I will not be harmed, like I will be strong, I will not be harmed. So vulnerability has been a huge path I hear for you and also for me. So I think it is an important concept, and to hear you share personally about that also just goes to show that you walk, what is it, you talk the talk but you walk the walk, or
Yeah,
whatever that
yeah,
little
yeah,
saying is,
yeah.
so yeah.
Mhm.
So what does it even look like to be vulnerable? And like, you already kind of touched on why this is important, but like kind of flush that out for me a little bit.
Yeah, so I think one of the things, to be vulnerable, um, personally, I think is showing up, and it requires taking some risk, and also doing, getting in touch with yourself. I think one of the things
Hmm.
that I started to recognize in my life is that to be vulnerable is to also starting to understand my own internal process, internal world, what's going on. So when I don't feel comfortable in a space, or when I need help, is to take that risk and to reach out and to share, or to say, hey, I'm really struggling here. And I think with that, it when when for me personally, when I wouldn't take those risks, I would also, with the same like, it's protective, right? I'm trying to protect
Yeah.
myself. I don't want to be vulnerable,
Hmm.
so I'm trying to be strong, and so I can't ask for help. But at the same time, in doing so, I would rob myself of developing meaningful and powerful and rich connections with other people.
Connections. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's by personally, when I think about vulnerability, is to show up in a space, to be who you are, and when things are coming up for you, to share.
Yeah.
And I also recognize now that can be really scary and really
Mm-hmm.
challenging to do that. So first, I think maybe finding spaces where you are able to
Yeah.
share a supportive environment, supportive
Mm-hmm.
friendships, supportive relationships, where you can take that risk and not feel like my world is about to crumble.
Yeah. And
Hmm.
I think that sometimes when we talk about this, it can almost seem like just put your, like you should be like good to do it in a moment, like just share yourself, put yourself out there. But I know for me, it's really actually sometimes I have missed moments of vulnerability and connection. I've been strong instead of vulnerable. And for me, sometimes that has looked like realizing that later on and having to come back to that person and be like, hey, this is actually what was going on for me. So, even if someone is not able to like implement this immediately, it still is okay just to form connections with people that I think you can come back and continue. You can always, just ones that you can kind of continue the work of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think one of the things, as you're sharing, I'm just thinking about language to describe the experiences. I personally, I'm speaking from my personal experiences, I had no idea what was going on. And to ask me
Mm,
to share in a moment, that would have been really scary. So for me, a
right.
lot of that required to getting in touch and reflecting like, okay, I didn't feel good here. What about
Yeah.
this interaction that made me feel really not okay? And to
Yeah.
do that work and then later to have that courage. I remember it was just shaking at first to have those conversations, but the more I do it, the more I felt like, wow. And especially when people would say, hey, thanks for sharing that with me. I know
Yeah.
for me, like especially in the circle, in the community where I grew up, everybody looks really good on the outside. They look really well put together, and to share, you almost stand out. To share what's going on, or to be real, you almost stand out as a unique, different person in the circle.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I remember I got to a point one time where I was just like, okay, this is really not okay. I don't feel okay. I feel like I'm living my life on automatic responses here, just navigating these different spaces, whether it's in the
Yeah.
friendship relationships or in the community or elsewhere, just navigating these different spaces. And I don't feel authentic to myself. And so when I started to
Hmm.
speak out on what was going on for me and how I felt and what was happening in the relationships, it was almost like a, a breath of fresh air. You're feeling this way as well. I thought I was the only
Yeah.
one. And so I, when I look back, those were the moments where I started to develop meaningful relationships. But it took, like you're saying,
Yeah.
it takes some time to that
Cultivate.
that strength,
Yeah.
that courage, and that also awareness where you're developing that awareness on your own, like, okay, I'm not feeling good, what's going on, instead of
Hmm.
going on the automatic response, this just a reaction that we've developed to protect ourselves to there's nothing wrong with that. I think we develop it to help us to navigate through those challenges, through the relationships, through the spaces that we've been a part of, as a way to protect us, as a way
Yeah.
to help us be who we are. And I think that's great. And now it could also be the very thing that keeps us stuck.
I agree 1,000,000%. And I think what people, well, we typically think of vulnerability as sometimes just a male problem or just well, we think about it in a very narrow box, but really it's a human problem,
Hmm.
and a lot of, I feel like Brene Brown's work has really showed that this is just a human thing,
Yeah.
to be vulnerable. But I think that whether people can put language to it or not, to be vulnerable, the picture always comes to my mind of like a dog that trusts you, that's willing to roll over and let you rub its belly, because that's where all of its vital organs are. So if
Mm.
you harm the soft belly of any type of animal, you actually like you risk death because those are the things that like your body runs off of. So sometimes that the risk you're talking about and the fear is literally if I roll over and show my soft side, if I don't protect that softness, I might die. And I think that that's really sometimes the like something if something bad might happen to me that will change my life for the worse, and it can feel like I might die. But I love what you kind of said about like it may be really protective and kind of maladaptive, but still adaptive coping. You know, like it just has negative consequences and maybe keeping a person stuck in their
Yeah,
in that place.
absolutely. And I think as you're talking about like this feeling of, it's almost like this survival. If I trust this person, I mean, it's really hard. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is that that's a coping strategy we've developed, especially when we have either trauma or really difficult experiences, or when we try to be vulnerable that was shamed or looked down upon.
Yeah.
Um, there's several people I've talked to, and the response I would get is, no, we don't. Vulnerability is not something we do. We drink it away, or we shut it down,
Hmm.
or
Yep.
we escape.
What? Yep.
Yeah, that's not something we even think about. And so,
Hmm.
and I think this risk that we're talking about, it really is depending on our environment and depending on the people that we're around. With some
Yeah.
spaces may be easier, and others, it may feel like a really life-threatening experience.
Yeah. Exactly. So, I feel like you've said so many helpful things just about your experientially why
Mhm.
this is hard, but also why it's important is I think if any of us don't do this, we'll be really lonely in life. But as you're kind of thinking, if as people are listening with us, we're always kind of I love to end with just like a resource or two that you think is helpful as people. If anybody's interested in really doing the whole vulnerability thing, where can they go? What can they do? How can they start down that path?
Yeah, yeah, and I think just just before I go jump into a resource, I want to highlight, as you mentioned, the reason why it's important is those connections, the power of connections, the richness
Yeah.
of life and experiences of being aware, and I think it takes risk and courage, and it's so rewarding and empowering. In terms of resources, I think one of the things, if you're interested in vulnerability and would like to develop more understanding about it, anything by Brene Brown, either Daring
Hmm.
Greatly, The Call to Courage on Netflix, or a TED Talk she has, really great introduction to vulnerability. Another thing in terms of vulnerability, I would just think about maybe setting aside some time, whether it's at the end of the day or whenever you have, and just really checking in with yourself. And I think that would be a really good start to just check in. How am I doing today? What
Hmm.
about these experiences today made me
Yeah.
feel the way I feel?
Yeah.
Um, and do I want to do anything about it?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I think one of the last ones too is what you said about safe spaces. As people are trying to cultivate safe places, sometimes the world is too risky. And that's why I think counseling is a uniquely safe space, is because confidentiality and how clinicians, therapists are trained is literally to try to cultivate safety and vulnerability so that you can really actually do so. So if the outside world, I think, sometimes feels too unsafe to do that, that's why I think counseling can be a really good space to start to practice that with another human being, because any therapist is a relationship, you know, so you're still doing relationship even though it's a really kind of boundary unique one. So um I I think that that's usually a really, really good place too for people to do some of that inner check-in, to do some of that vulnerability work.
Absolutely. And I think to reach out for counseling in itself is a vulnerable process. To reach out
Yeah.
and to show up as you
Yeah.
are. And I think in counseling, oftentimes it takes time to develop that relationship where people
Yeah.
themselves to empower them to be vulnerable. I think as you're sharing, absolutely, counseling is one of the best ways to continue to develop language, to
I think so.
understanding personal self, to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
empowering. Um, yeah.
Obviously, we're a little biased, but so Victor, thank you so much for you know, this topic is of interest to you. You have brought so much today to this conversation. I thank you for showing up today and talking with me about this, just kind of going back and forth and sharing just some of your experience around it. I really appreciate it.
Always my pleasure.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Thank you. You too.